The next selector we'll look at is called the attribute selector, and this allows us to select elements based upon some particular attribute. So a really common example is working with input elements, where we've seen the type attribute drastically varies the actual rendered input, whether it's a checkbox, a radio button, a text input, a password input, and so on. If we wanted to select one type of those, in this case I'm selecting all inputs where type is set to text, we use the attribute selector. We use the square brackets, and then inside the attribute name equals something. So we don't really have a great example to select on this page. What I'm going to do is, I guess I'll add in another input type. I'll add a password input perhaps, maybe down at the bottom. I'll do, maybe just up top. I'll probably delete it, but just demonstrate this. So input type equals password, and I'll add placeholder that just says password as well. Okay. So I'll save. There's our beautiful password input. And if I wanted to select just that one and style it differently, maybe change the color of those dots, what I can do is go into my CSS. I'm not going to select all inputs. I mean, I could start there and just say color is, how about green, yellow? Sure. Refresh. And now as I type, ooh, that's horrible to read, but you can see we get that green, yellow in there and over here. Maybe you can't see that. It's pretty tough. Very low contrast. But if I instead said input where type equals password, just like that, I need those square brackets, I need type equals password. Now it's only this input or any other password inputs. I just happen to have one, not this one, which is a text input. Okay, so that's one example. You can even do things that are kind of janky and odd, like I could select using any attribute, including something like class. Class is an attribute, so is ID. So I could say every section where class is equal to post. Now, it'd be much easier just to say post, right? But I could do this. Section where class is equal to post, I'll give them a background color of purple. And I'm going to delete this, but I just want to demonstrate that we can select by any attribute. Actually, a better way of doing this, just for the record, if we had this class post applied to multiple different types of elements, so not just sections, but maybe it was on a div or a nav or something else, and I only want to select the sections with that class, I can do this, section dot post. And that's going to select only the sections with the class of post. Anyway, there is more to the attribute selector. It's pretty rare at least in my experience, to use this syntax, but you can use these other versions where instead of just a direct equal sign, which is the most common, you can do things like star equals, which is like a fuzzier matching. So in this case, any anchor tag where the href attribute contains example. So why don't I go back to my index? Let's look at some of our hrefs here. We've got, they all start with this hash sign, but why don't I make one of them? How about instead of puppies, I'll do Google. And then in here, I'll do google.com, maybe www.google.com. And then if I wanted to select just this anchor tag, I personally think this is kind of janky to do it this way, but I can. I could say anchor tags for the href, star equals, and then Google. And I'll give it a different color. How about magenta? Sure. Refresh. And there it is. It gets that magenta color. And none of the other anchor tags do. So that's saying anywhere inside of the anchor tag. I can also do things like this. A $sign equals, which is the href has to end in .org. Now this is not only for hrefs, by the way. This could be for any attribute. So I could do really weird things like any input where the type attribute starts with the letter T or the letter P or something. I don't know why you would do that, but you can. But most of the time I'm just working with the equal sign, if anything. But there are these other variants, just not as common in my experience. And if you have more questions on this, I wouldn't worry too much, but you can take a look at the MDN documentation. There are a couple of other versions that we did not talk about, and they have examples for all of them. There's also ways to make it case insensitive. So, if I had Google here with a capital G, it's not going to match right now because the attribute href on that anchor tag only has a lowercase g. Okay, so that is using the attribute selector most commonly. I'm using it for things like this, selecting based off of the type attribute to get one type of input, or maybe using an href attribute, but it's not very common that I want to style links differently based upon where they're from. So honestly, just know that it exists. It is important, but nowhere near as commonly used as the other selectors we've seen.